Well, welcome again to our biblical counseling training course. And this is the next session where in this video, we're going to be talking about gathering data. And before we dive into the topic, there's just a couple things that I want to share with you. First, again, is just to remind you about the Personal Growth Project. Hopefully, you're making good headway on that and you are learning a lot about yourself and gaining an understanding of the biblical change process through doing that project. A couple other things that I just want to mention to you is because we're talking about data gathering, I wanted to bring to your attention a couple good resources that would be beneficial for you in this process. The first one is this one right here. It's by Wayne Mack, A Practical Guide for Effective Biblical Counseling. And Wayne Mack has been in the biblical counseling world for a long time, and he has a lot to share. He's very practical in what he teaches, and this resource is very manageable, but it has a couple chapters in there particularly on what we're going to be talking about today in terms of gathering information so that you can counsel better. Another resource to look at is one that you are required to read for this training, and it's Instruments in the Redeemer's Hands, written by Paul Tripp. And this has been kind of a gold standard in the biblical counseling world for a few decades now. And one of the things that this does is it helps you understand and know how to ask good questions. And one of the things he even says in here is biblical counseling, the work of biblical counseling is making sure you're asking good questions, because it's when we ask good questions that we get the information that we need so that we can help the people with the problems that they have. So those are two things that I just wanted to highlight for you. That will be helpful, particularly when it comes to data gathering. And today with us, we have Pastor Austin Collins, who is, his official title is the Serve Pastor here at First Baptist Church. And all of what entails that job, I don't really know exactly what you do, but I know you do a lot because you're always everywhere doing everything. So and Pastor Austin happens to be also one of our certified biblical counselors, and that serves in our ministry and does a great job at counseling people, and he's counseling right now. And so we're very thankful for the work that you do and to helping us counsel the people of our church.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here today.
Great. So one of the things that I want to make sure that we do is to spend some time in the Bible right before we dive in. And particularly because we're talking about gathering data, the verse that I want us to look at is Proverbs 18:13. And so if you have your Bibles, we'll just go ahead and take a look at that real quick, because this will kind of set the tone and give us a broad understanding of what we're going to be tackling today in this issue of data gathering. So Proverbs 18:13 says this. It says, "If one gives an answer before he hears, it is to his folly and shame." And one of the reasons that Pastor Austin will go into more detail on this later, but it's important for us to have good information, and because it's when we have good information, we can counsel better. And so we want to make sure that we're asking questions and making sure we're finding out what we need to find out about the person that we're helping, because what this verse is warning us is that if we give an answer before we hear, if we give an answer before we fully understand, we are foolish, and we don't want to be fools, and we don't want to derail the counseling process because we're not doing our due diligence to find out the right information. So, Austin, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I actually start most of my counseling sessions, like session 1 with a new counselee, by going straight to this verse. And even in the first session, just saying something like, listen, this verse says that if I try to help you without understanding what's going on in your life, that makes me a fool. And I personally, I just don't want to be a fool. But you, sitting in that chair, you don't want me to be a fool either, because then I'm probably going to give you really bad advice. And you didn't come here for bad advice. You came here to solve a problem. So one of the things I'm going to do here in this first session with you, and even the second session, and even into the third, is I'm just going to be listening and asking you a lot of questions. That's part of the process. And I need to know what's going on in your life. So I love this verse. I use it all the time.
That's good.
But I have a question for you.
Sure.
as we think about gathering data, is it data or data?
Depends on which side of the country you live on. No, I say gathering data, but it's like pecan or pecan. It's
It's contextual.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
basically, yeah. Well, so and hopefully you are not confused by that either. But here we go. We're going to go ahead and dive into our session. And you just mentioned about the fact that in the first couple of sessions, you're just going to listen. So why don't we start there? That why is it important for us to be good listeners?
Yeah, there's a huge need for us to be good listeners to gather data. The first reason would be this: wise counselors, they listen before they start speaking. We see that from Proverbs 18:13, as we just read, that we have to understand what is going on in this person's life, what brought them into counseling. Have they been in counseling before? Was it a different kind of counseling? What are the different ways that they've tried to solve their problem? How did they even get into this mess? Because if we don't have those facts, if we open our mouths and start trying to talk and give them a solution to their problem, if counseling really is just one person helping another person solve a problem, if we try and open our mouths and give them advice without understanding what the situation is in, what we have done is we've actually put ourselves in the position of Job's counselors. And giving instruction or giving counsel or advice or anything like that without understanding how the person got there, what their actual problem is, what's going on in their heart, when we give that instruction without understanding, we are doing what Job's friends did. So in Job 19, 1-3, Job answered and said, "How long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? These 10 times you have cast reproach upon me. Are you not ashamed to wrong me?" So that's a really key verse in understanding that we as counselors actually have a lot riding on our shoulders when we're sitting in the counseling room with a counselee. We, as people who are trying to be compassionate and helpful and helping people solve problems, we actually have the power to make it worse for them. That's what happened to Job. His friends showed up and they sat with him in silence for a little while. They didn't ask any questions. They just mourned with him when he was being tested and tried in all those different ways. And what ended up happening is when they finally opened their mouth, they didn't have all the facts. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know what was going on. First of all, in Job's heart, they hadn't asked him, like, "Hey man, how you feeling? Like, what's going through your mind? Anything happened that caused this? Like, what brought you to this place?" They definitely, and we find out, by the end of the book, they didn't have the answers of what was going on in heaven, right? There's all sorts of stuff going on between God and Satan behind the scenes. But what stands in this situation is Job says, "You guys didn't ask me about what was going on in my life. You just walked in the door and started pointing your finger and accusing me of being sinful or of somehow like transgressing the law. And you've now told me 10 different ways that I have messed up, I have sinned, I have done wrong. And I'm telling you that that's not the facts. That's not the story. That's not what's going on here. And all you're doing is ruining this friendship and ruining this relationship. And it's making me really, really sad." And so as counselors, we want to be wise and we want to take this proverb to heart that we need to hear before we give an answer. We need to listen before we speak. I think the second thing we need to think about when we're thinking about gathering data is that a wise counselor seeks knowledge. So this isn't just like a passive reception of facts. We're not in it just to let the person start talking and hopefully we can glean something from it. So 2 verses later in Proverbs, chapter 18, verse 15, "An intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge." I think part of what's involved in this verse is the fact that it can be, especially with certain types of people, to just let them sit in the chair or on the couch And you, as a counselor, just lean back and you just let them start talking. You let them say whatever they want to say. And it actually half the time will lead you nowhere. You're not gathering facts that are pertinent to the problem. They're telling you about their cousin's dog's surgery. And you're like, man, I'm so sorry. We can pray about that. But you're here because your PDI said this. And so part of our job as being a wise counselor is to seek after knowledge, to have a purpose and a direction in the way that we ask questions, in the way that we ask people to tell us about what's going on in their life. And the other thing is we need to seek knowledge because first impressions can be really, really deceiving. We think about the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Verse 12 and 14, as Hannah continued praying before the Lord, Eli, the priest, observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. And we know that Hannah, pushes back, and she's like, I'm not drunk, I'm just praying. And so Eli didn't get all the facts. He didn't ask questions first. And again, similar to Job's friends, he walks in, he sees what he sees, he gets his first impression, and he starts pointing the finger and casting blame where there was truly no blame. In fact, not only was Hannah not sinning, she was actually doing the righteous thing and responding properly in her heart before the Lord by praying and asking for a son. So we need to seek after knowledge in a very pointed and concentrated way. We need to be very specific in the way that we ask questions because we need answers about certain problems. People are complex. Our lives are big. There's a whole lot going on in any person's life at any point. But in counseling, if we're there to target one particular issue and deal with certain problems in the heart that the person has come in needing help with, then we've got to get the facts about that. And not every single fact is created equal in that scenario.
Right.
I think there's a third thing. I think the wise counselor hears both sides. So again, 2 verses later, Proverbs 18:17, the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. I mean, this verse is everything in marriage counseling, right?
I was just going to say that sounds like a perfect marriage counseling passage.
It really is, because if you counsel couples separately at any point, the husband's going to say, well, she did so-and-so, or she said so-and-so. And then you go ask the wife, what happened? Well, he did so-and-so, and he did this. And everything turns into a he said, she said. And again, Proverbs is about wisdom. And so our job is we are going to hear one side of the story, and it can be really easy for the counselor in that moment to hear hard things, to hear painful things from one side of the story, to hear and to want to run towards that person, sometimes in compassion on one hand, or to even maybe be a little bit repulsed by some of the sinful actions that person has discussed. And what we can find ourselves doing if we haven't gathered all the facts by hearing both sides of the story is ourselves as counselors taking sides in the counseling room again between a husband and a wife. And Proverbs here says we have to always get both sides of the story. You can hear it from one person, but until you hear the other person's perspective, you haven't gotten the whole story. And for you to start speaking into a situation without having both sides of the story can be really dangerous. It's not always possible to get both sides of the story at the end of the day. There's all sorts of scenarios, but in most normal situations, it's really easy to, after that session ends, to pick up the phone and call the other person that's involved or something like that. So we have to get both sides. At the same time that we're listening to both sides, there's another danger where people can fall into gossip. And one of the things that we don't want to allow to happen during a counseling session is for our counselee to fall into further sin by the way that they're talking about somebody. So 1 Timothy 5:13, besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house And not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies saying what they should not. So as you are asking good questions and trying to figure out what's going on, you also need to be guarding your own heart and helping the counselee to guard their own heart against gossip, right? If you discern that this counselee is just now starting to bad talk somebody else, or to use language about another person or a situation that they should not be using, then you need to stop them. We need to rebuke them in that moment gently, because we can't allow them to fall into further sin. We need to get the facts, but we don't need to gossip in the meantime.
So, two practical questions on that. Well, one of the things that I think it's great that you're bringing up those biblical examples of Job and Hannah, particularly with Job. It seems like they best served Job for those 7 days when they were silent, and then but didn't ask any questions. So that was good that you brought that out. But just two questions. So if you could flesh that out a little bit more about what you just said about guarding against gossip. What are some other things that we might need to look out for, so that we're making sure that we're getting facts and not interpretation?
Yeah. Well, even in thinking about guarding against gossip, you have to guard your own heart as a counselor in the way that you ask questions, particularly about like sexual situations. You need to know enough and to hear enough to be able to deal with problems concretely and very specifically. But you also don't need to know so much that you're starting to, in your own mind, sin or fantasize or think wrong thoughts about the person. So if we're thinking about pushing back against gossip or keeping gossip out of the counseling room, one of the easiest ways to identify it is when the counselee no longer talks about themselves and only talks about other people. When you ask, how did you react to this situation? Like, what was your response? And they just immediately keep telling you about what that other person did or how bad it was. That's one way that you can know you're probably stepping into the gossip territory, because they've moved the locus of counseling off of themselves and onto the other person who's probably not in the room with you. And you can't help the person that's not in the room with you. Another way that you can discern gossip is when they start telling you a bunch of stuff that is ultimately peripheral to the reason why they are in there. If they start making comments about a person that have nothing to do with the current situation or circumstance that they're in, they're starting to slip into gossip. You can also look out for things like body language. If they're making eye contact with you and telling you facts, and then when they start talking about another person, they won't look you in the face. Those are some signs as well.
That's helpful. That's helpful. Anything else on this area of listening that would be important for us to know?
I think James 1 is super important here, right? James 1:19. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear and slow to speak, slow to anger. So that's a direct command from the Bible. You must be slow to speak and quick to hear. The Bible says that being slow to speak actually helps us to season our words with salt. Colossians 4:6, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. So one of the things about salt is that the longer you let something brine, the better the end result, right? If you're about to cook a steak and you just get it out of the fridge and you throw it in the frying pan and you start cooking it and then you sprinkle salt all over it, you're going to end up with this tough, gross, not great steak. But if you have instead given that steak some time to soak in the salt, if you salt it, let it sit overnight, the end result, that steak's going to be a lot better. And I think that's true with the way that we as counselors should speak. We need to get really comfortable with awkward silences, especially when someone drops heavy information on you. If you ask the right questions and they're dropping shocking information on you, or information. You thought you were going down this route, and they drop a bombshell, and now you're like, whoa, we've got to reconfigure everything and go down this other way. Um, it is okay to take some time and to pause, even as a counselor, and just say, let me think about that for a second. I want to make sure that I can respond to you in a godly way. I want to make sure that I'm processing what you're saying properly. And I just need a moment to think about that, but let me do that. Another thing that you can do is to repeat back to them what they've said. To make sure that you're getting it properly. That kind of gets into interpreting data properly, but even just factually, somebody might just be talking at a mile a minute, and it's hard just keeping track of everything. And they're telling you like, this happened on Tuesday, and then 3 Wednesdays later this happened, and then but back on Saturday, blah blah blah. And it's hard just to keep timeline straight or facts straight or names or who's related to who, because they're living their situation day by day. You're just now stepping into it for the first time most of the time. And so even just saying, hey, can you slow down just a second? I want to make sure that I got, so you're saying Jim is Bob's brother? Is that correct? Oh, yeah. That's right. Okay, great. Thank you. I just want to make sure I got that right. So pausing and asking, hey, am I understanding you correctly? Even just with facts, but especially as you get further on with interpretation, that's super crucial.
Yeah. Well, and I think that kind of goes into the next question that I want to ask, which is more on the practical level in terms of when we're talking about listening. What are some, you would think that listening would be very intuitive, like it would become naturally, but it is a skill that we need to grow in. So what are some of those things that help us be better listeners?
Yeah. How to gather data is a really, you're right. It's a skill. Most people are not great listeners when they first get started in it, because there's a lot of things underneath that are going on for a good listener that they are practiced in that new counselors often just simply aren't. So I have a few ways to do that. So at the end of the day, gathering data primarily is about asking the right questions, asking good questions, asking the right questions, asking questions in a way that they're going to be received and that you're going to get the information that you need. So the first 3 questions to always ask, and a lot of different counseling ministries will put these 3 questions on their PDI or their intake forms. But the first one is this: what's your problem? Why are you here? What brought you to counseling? Something is going on in your life that you believed you needed some help with, and you needed intensive help with it, and it brought you here. What is that problem? What do you think your problem is? They could be right or wrong about what their true problem is, and you'll discern that moving on down the road. But you also need to take people at face value when they come in and tell you what their problem is, until you've been proven otherwise. The second question: what's your problem? What have you done about it? Oh, I've tried everything. Oh, I've prayed about it a lot. Oh, well, I'm just trying to let it go. What have you done about it? All of these different potential solutions, they've not worked, and that's why you're here. And most likely, the solutions that we tend to gravitate towards are in our sin are not the solutions that God has offered in His Word. And that's honestly the hope of them being in the chair, is you've got hope in God's Word that you can offer them in solutions. The last question, so what's your problem? What have you done about it? The last question is, what do you want me to do about it? Why are you here in counseling? What do you think that I, as a pastor or a counselor, or even just, at a coffee shop as a friend, what do you think I can do to help you in this moment? And you're going to get all sorts of different answers to that question. Well, I just need someone to listen. Well, I don't know. I want to know what the Bible says, and you're a pastor, so I figure you could tell me. There's all sorts of different answers, but those 3 basic questions I would say ask every single time. And honestly, even if you've asked them on your intake form or your PDI, ask them again in person, especially when there has been a gap in time from when you received their form to when you set up their first session. Sometimes that can be a week. Sometimes it's a day. Sometimes it's a week. Sometimes it might even be a month, just trying to align schedules, right? And a lot can change between when they answered those questions back then and when they finally arrived in the session. So getting the most up-to-date information on that is super crucial. The next two are kind of related. So we need to ask extensive questions and we need to ask intensive questions. I think about this as kind of a shotgun approach with a spread of bullets that are going all over the place and you're hoping one of them hits. And then intensive questioning would be that rifle. You're shooting one bullet in one direction, but you know where it's going. And when it hits the target, it's going to do what it's trying to do. So we can break down both of those. They both have use in the counseling room. So extensive questions help you as a counselor who potentially you don't know this person, you've never met them before. They've just showed up at your counseling doorstep and said, I need help. And you've never seen them before. You didn't know their name until they showed up. And so extensive questioning is very broad, general, big picture questions to help you just get kind of a sense of who this person is. So you want to hit a very broad range of categories, but you can't settle for vague answers in those categories. So even when you're asking questions all over the place about this person's life, we'll talk about some of those areas in a second, you still need to make sure that the answers they're giving you aren't these like vague generalities. You want them to give you like hard, concrete facts. Was it 2 years ago or was it 7 years ago? That 5-year gap can make a difference. Oh, it was a long time in the past. Was that a few months ago? Was that a few years ago? It matters. So in the extensive questioning, this is usually taking place very early on in your early sessions in kind of the arc of counseling. So sessions 1, 2, 3, getting to know them. So I kind of work through the person's life systematically. And I let them know that ahead of time. Is in those first couple of sessions, I'm like, hey, listen, I'm going to ask you questions that you might think are totally irrelevant to what's going on, but the key to solving your problem might be in there somewhere. It might help us connect what's going on in your life now to the scriptures. And so I'm just going to ask you all over the place. So,
well, and that kind of seems like going through their whole life like that, you can start to see patterns where they may be coming in with one problem, but you're seeing this problem pop up in other areas. And so asking those extensive questions could be very helpful in seeing those patterns.
Yeah. And that's especially with, we talk about life dominating sins like addictions, where these particular sins have an effect in every single area of someone's life. So some of these categories. So birth, where were you born? Were you born even like out of wedlock? Were your parents around when you were a kid? Did your parents divorce early? What was it like growing up in your schooling situation? Did you go to public school? Did you go to private school? Did you go to homeschool? What did you think about school? Were you good at school? Like, were you a good student? Were you not? What was your life like growing up? Who were your friends? What did you do for fun? Did you travel around a lot? Were you a military kid? All those questions about growing up, they help. Then I like to move into family. So, tell me about your mom. Tell me about your dad. Tell me about your siblings. Do you have any brothers or sisters? Where do you fall in the category? Is there significant age gaps between, is it you're the oldest of 8 kids? Are you an only child? Were you born and then your parents had another kid 15 years later? All of those things affect a person's life. So parents, siblings, tell me about your spouse, your husband, your wife. Tell me about your kids. How did you and your husband and wife meet? How many kids do you have? How old are they? What's your relationship like with all of these different people? You can even talk about in-laws, especially in a marriage situation.
Yes.
You should ask about in-laws.
Yes, definitely.
Or just other relatives that you might have. Somebody's uncle might be really important in their life for whatever reason. friends, coworkers, neighbors, other significant relationships, mentorships, business partnerships. Are you in some sort of legal, financial partnership with another person? Those kinds of things matter. Learning about their job, if they're working or if they're not working.
Mhm.
They could be unemployed.
Very important piece.
What do they think about their job? They like their boss? Do they love doing what they're doing? Do they feel like they're using their gifts in their line of work? If they're not of working age yet, like if they're still in school, maybe they're a college student, tell me about school. Making good grades. What's your major? When you plan to graduate? What's your favorite class? All of those things are going to give you hints about the person's life. You also need to ask about spiritual disciplines. We talk about this in I think another session, but you can't counsel somebody that's not a Christian. And so part of your extensive data gathering is to help you discern, can you even go into session 2 the way that you planned? Or are you going to have to back up and like pre-counsel or evangelize this person instead? So spiritual disciplines, Bible intake, prayer. Do they go to church? Do they listen to sermons? Do they serve in their church? Do they give regularly to their church? All of those things. Asking about physical health. Physical health is super important. What's their diet like? What exercise routines do they do? What's their sleep? Sleep is huge. You have to find out about sleep no matter what. If the person's sleeping 4 hours a night, they're going to have problems.
It's amazing how those 3 things, sleep, diet, and exercise, impact so much.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And so if you start hearing concerns in those areas, they need to go talk to a medical doctor and work through some of those with a medical doctor for sure. What chronic conditions might they have? Are they on long-term medications to deal with that? It could be psychotropic drugs. It could just be cholesterol medication. Do they have any like permanent injuries? I've got a finger injury that messed with me a few years ago, and I've got it now, and I have thoughts and feelings about this finger injury that I sustained. Sexual activity, not even if they're husband or wife, right? You got to ask about sexual activity. Other areas, finances, stewardship of their resources. So not just like, are you good with money? Do you have a budget? Are you investing? Are you saving for retirement? Those things are important. But how do you use your time? Are you disciplined in scheduling yourself out to make sure that you're getting to appointments on time, that you're taking care of all the tasks God needs you to do each day? What's your social, your recreational life? What hobbies do they have? Asking about hobbies is a great way even just to build involvement with them, because it helps them to feel like, man, you really care about me, and not just my problem. I'm not a project to you, but like I've had lots of great conversations with counselees because we end up hitting it off about hobbies, and that just helps build that relationship. But you'd never know unless you ask. The last one I ask about always is major life events. So deaths, maybe in your family, maybe you had a close friend who died in a car wreck, things like that. So major crises that you might have walked through, just shaping life events. And if people have those, they will very quickly tell you about them. Typically, you won't find out about those 10 sessions in. They're like, why didn't you tell me that this happened to you? Like they'll usually be pretty upfront about that. They know exactly what you're talking about. So those are just very broad categories, and asking 2 or 3 in each one is really helpful in those first few sessions just to get the lay of the land. And like you said earlier, you're going to start connecting the dots really fast. You're going to get 2 or 3 of these items into that list, and you're going to start forming an idea of what this person is like. You can't assume, you can't jump to conclusions, but just by these broad scattershot questions, you're going to get a really good idea of what's going on.
Yeah, I can see that particularly. You mentioned about like somebody struggling with addiction. I mean, if somebody's struggling with alcohol, you can see how that would affect so many of those categories: their finances, their use of time, their relationships with the family, relationships at work. And so you can see how that one sin issue touches so many different things.
Absolutely. And what's awesome in that moment is even in like the first session, when you can notice that kind of a pattern, you immediately have like this like extra large dose of hope that you can inject into their life, because you can then just go back and say like, listen, as I've been hearing you talk about all of these different areas of your life, I think we can both agree that alcohol has affected all of these different areas. And if you can deal with what's at the root of your, drunkenness, look at all of these different ways that it's going to impact your life for good. Don't and all you got to do is deal with this one problem. Now it's one problem that's got a big effect, but it's one problem and you can deal with it, and it will change your whole life. It's not just going to change your relationship with your wife. That's great. We want that. It won't just change your relationship with your kids. We want that. It's going to change everything about who you are. And I love being able just to inject that dose of hope right
That's
then and
great.
there.
Yeah, that's great.
Um, so I know that was a lot of categories kind of broadly. There's a lot of different acronyms out there that you can use to help you remember these. Honestly, you need to take some notes in, especially those first few sessions with some of these lists. But there's lots of different acronyms. We've included some on the handouts for this lesson. Wayne Mack uses PREACHD, PREACHD, and it's just a way to help you remember all the different elements of the person's life to ask through. Another great counselor I know, he uses STORE, STOREE, and that walks through like what's the situation, what's their thinking, what's their emotions, all of those different things. So you use, as a counselor, whatever helps you to remember what you need. Or if you just want to have the list of all these different categories and take that into your first couple of sessions, and just take notes, that's great too. So that's extensive data. Intensive, again, is like, okay, you've identified what the problem is, and we need to get really specific really fast on what this is. So these are very pointed and specific questions about certain topics. For instance, a young man comes in and he's struggling with pornography. You have to ask the question of like, how often do you look at pornography? And you can't have vague answers come in. It's every once in a while. What is every once in a while? Is that once a week? Is that once a day? Is that once a month? Is that after particular certain stressful situations that you repeatedly find yourself in? So you need very specific and concrete data in this point. And you need to, as a counselor, press them until you get it. And even if you need to give them examples like that of like, hey, listen, I know you said like frequent or, every once in a while. Can you give me a number? Can you give me is it once a week, 3 times a week? I don't know. Intensity, like when you look at pornography, how long are you doing it? Is it a 5-minute scroll through something, or is it, 3 hours alone? And all of that data matters to help you understand the intensity of the problem. What are some of the things that trigger this problem occurring? Is it a stress, like whenever you find yourself at a stressful situation in your work? Is that when you fall into this pattern of sin? So you need to get really, really specific in these intensive questions. And again, the counselee, by virtue of the fact that they have come in for counseling, has actually already invited you into their life to ask those questions. Those aren't necessarily questions that I'm going to go ask the average church member when I'm having coffee with them down the street. But in a counseling situation where someone's signed up to show up for counseling, they're coming in with a little bit of an expectation that you're going to ask those questions. And in fact, if you don't ask those questions, the discerning counselee is going to lose confidence in your ability to help them.
Well, and that was one of the things that got brought up in a previous video about how counseling is basically somebody who has a problem going to somebody who they think can help with that problem. And and we're in this conversation about gathering data, so it's important for them to share those things with you. And so I think that's a good point to bring up, to say that the very fact that they signed up for this means that they're on a certain level willing to have those things dissected a little bit, and inviting you into that understanding. So
Yeah. They've taken the no soliciting sign down from their heart when they've come in. So you got to use concrete language. Don't assume that you know what your counselee means. So you'll have people that they'll tell you something kind of vague or general, and they're like, you know what I mean? And you should very kindly say, no, I don't. Can you be a little more specific with that? You always need to ask them to elucidate. Like, pretend I don't know what you mean, and you really might. You might know what they mean. But you need to pretend like you don't and get them to spell that out for you. So you need to require concrete language in data gathering, both of yourself and of the counselee. So if you ask vague questions, you're going to get vague answers. So think about asking, like, there's a difference between saying, like, well, how was your week? How's things been? I mean, that could go anywhere. That's a big category. Versus asking something like, hey, how did the things that we talked about from Matthew 7 last week impact the way that you behaved this week? That's a very different type of question. It's pointed, it's specific, it's concrete, because you're connecting it to something that you've taught, and you're asking, like, what change has taken place? And by them answering that question, you'll get a general feel of how their week went. But by forcing it on yourself that you're going to use very concrete, targeted language in asking questions, you're doing what Proverbs 18:15 told us, which is to seek after knowledge. But not only should you require it of yourself, you need to require it of the counselee, like we just said. If they say something like, well, I only fill in the blank sin a few times last week, that's very different than getting them to admit 4 times this week at night, just before bed, I fill in the blank. That tells you something very different than just, I did it a few times this week. Because now listen, something is going on at nighttime, right before bed, and we need to target changing your patterns of your life around that time of night. We need to figure out what's going on in your heart late at night, right before you go to bed, that needs to change, that you need to repent of, and that will change this frequency and this pattern that's happening in these moments of temptation.
Yeah, so finding those patterns, I can see how that would be really, really helpful. Now, you've, throughout your explanation so far, you've been giving us really great examples of types of questions to ask. So let's kind of shift gears into that category now, in terms of what are the types of questions, are there categories of questions that we can ask to get at more specifics, like you're talking about?
There's 3, I think, really helpful principles to keep in your mind when asking questions. You need to always ask fact-based questions when you're gathering data. So I'm mostly specifically here talking about early on in the counseling arc, when you are still in the early phases of learning the person, and before they have been taught and trained in the model of thinking that we want them to think in biblically about their problem. So you want fact-based questions. So those are who, what, where, when, and how. Those kinds of questions, if your question starts with those words, you're going to get a fact-based answer. So when do you find yourself falling into this sin? Where do you find yourself being the most intensely tempted with that sin? Who is the person that puts the most pressure on you to commit this sin? Those kinds of questions. You will get names, you will get times, you will get people, places, and things, right? So you need to ask very fact-based questions. You need to avoid speculative or feelings-based questions. So those questions start with why. Don't ask why. They don't know why. That's why they're here. And they need to know why, because if they understand why, which is that they have sinful desires in their heart that are leading to sinful behaviors in their life, once they that's the why, and it's your job as the counselor to teach them the why and to help them to change. So later on, session 8 or 9 or I don't know, 36 even sometimes, when you know that they've internalized the understanding of like root and fruit or heart idols or just kind of these general categories of teaching, you can ask them why down there, like, hey, why'd you do that? And by that point, when you're further down the road, they ought to be able to say like, well, it's because I know that I desired control. And so when things got out of control, I yelled at my wife. Bingo. That's great. That is actually when you know counseling's working. But if you're asking that in session 1, like, hey, why'd you yell at your wife the other day? I don't know. I just did. You'll get those kinds of answers all the time. So avoid why, especially early on. The last one is avoid yes or no questions, unless you're asking for a commitment, which the only answer is yes. So avoid yes or no. They don't get you anywhere. And the way that you know that your question is going to wind up as a yes or no question is if it starts with the words is, have, or do. Do you find yourself often falling into this sin? Yes. Right. So you can practice yourself even, and I would try it, is practice asking questions even to a wall off the top of your head about a particular counseling situation, and see which way you tend to gravitate with the way that you ask your questions. You could record yourself and play it back and listen and find yourself like, man, I ask a lot of yes or no questions and I'm not getting the data that I need out of this person. And so this goes back to, there's a skill to listening because it requires that you're consciously always thinking in these fact-based questions and asking who, what, where, when, how. And that way, as you grow in that skill, it'll become more natural. It feels unnatural when you first start doing it. And then the last thing is this: you need to ask questions progressively. So this is just normal conversation. He says X, your eyebrows raise. You need to keep asking questions about X. Early on in the extensive data gathering, you might not be able to drill down as deep as you want about a particular thing, but you can always circle back. Hey, listen, last session, I made a note here that you said this about that. And I want to circle back around. I want to ask just a few more questions about that because I think that might be really important for us to be able to solve your problem. So that's how conversations just go. Someone says something and you think of a question to ask in response. So counseling should feel very normal and natural, like you are just having a dialogue with the person. If you continually, especially further on into sessions, are asking these very non sequitur questions that don't seem to connect to one another, it feels wooden, it feels robotic, it feels like you're not listening to the person. And so when they say something like, yeah, me and my wife, we haven't had sex in 4 years. And you're like, oh, okay, I'll note that. And then you just move on. I mean,
what did you have for dinner last night?
Yeah. Like, yeah. How'd things go? Do you like that burrito? Yeah. Like you should say like, hey, can I ask about that? Like, what do you think's caused that? So you need to be natural in your question asking and just be progressive in that sense.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of one, we can take a couple of the issues that we've raised already in terms of like alcohol or pornography. Asking the question to avoid is, do you drink alcohol? And that's a yes or no. And that doesn't give you much information. But if you ask things like, where do you drink, or what time do you drink, or with whom do you drink, that will give you a little bit more information about the situation. So I think that's a really good example of what to avoid and the types of questions that we need to ask. So when people are answering these questions, what are some of the things that we should be looking for?
Yeah. There's all sorts of things. So you're listening for facts and important facts you need to note. But what you're also listening for is what's going on in the person's heart underneath. So listen for who or what is the counselee serving? Who's their master? Who are they a slave to, or what are they a slave to? So Matthew 6:24, you can't serve both God and money. You can't have two masters. You're going to love one and you're going to hate the other. You can't have two. You can only have one. Is it God or is it something else? So you're listening for what are they a slave to? Who are they serving? You're listening for what is in their heart. They're going to tell you oftentimes about external behaviors that they're doing. Like, when I get angry, I punch a hole in the drywall. Okay. But Jesus says, like, that didn't just happen, right? Like, you didn't just spasm and punch a hole in the drywall. You had something going on in your heart first. So he talks about that in Mark 7, where the Pharisees are upset that the disciples aren't washing their hands properly before a meal. And Jesus uses that as an opportunity to say, listen, it's what's inside a person that defiles them. It's not the dirt on the outside of their hands. It's what's going on in the heart. And he gives this big list of sins that are present in all of our hearts that want to come out in different ways. You need to listen for what are they doing? What are those behaviors? What are they? How are they acting? What are they saying to other people? You can be listening to what influences them, what conforms them. That might be they keep telling you that they keep bringing up this same podcast over and over and over. Well, this guy on this podcast says I need to do this. And I'm like, well, that's not what the Bible says. Are you going to listen to the podcast or are you going to listen to the Bible? So listen to what's shaping them, what's conforming them. The scriptures say, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And counseling is about renewing the mind. You need to be listening for what fruit is the counselee evidencing. So we think about Galatians 5, really the whole second half of that chapter. Are they walking by the Spirit or are they walking by the flesh? There's fruits that result from walking in the flesh and carrying out the desires of the flesh. And Paul lists all of those. And then he says there's also fruits that show up when you walk by the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, so on. And as you're listening to the counselee, which fruits are they holding out in front of you as the evidence of what's going on in their hearts? Has the counselee changed? That's key, especially later on. Are they actually changing, or have you just been talking for a whole lot of sessions and nothing's actually taken place? And one that's really important, we see it in Genesis 3 and Genesis 4. What are they avoiding answering? No matter how you ask it, no matter what angle you seem to be going at, they keep avoiding answering your question directly. So Adam and Eve hid themselves from God. When they realized they had sinned, they were ashamed and they were guilty, so they hid from God. God also then comes later to Cain after he's killed Abel, and he's like, "Where's your brother, Cain?" And Cain's like, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? It's not my job. I don't know where he's at. You go figure it out." And he's trying to get God off of his case. And if you find that to be the case with a counselee, you've got an area to probe into.
Okay, well, those are really good things for us to think through and listen for when we're asking those questions. But and we've spent a lot of time on asking questions, and that's like one of the key areas of how we're going to gather data. Are there other ways in which we could gather information that we need for counseling?
There's a few tools that we can use. So the first one is the personal data inventory, or the intake form, whatever you call it. That thing, you need to know it backwards and forwards before you go into the first session. You need to have gone through it, marked it up, written questions on it that you want to ask about things that stick out on it that seem to be problem areas. And it needs to be the initial springboard for questions in the first few sessions. You should never assume that you know what the case is going to be like based off of their PDI. I think about a time where I had a counselee and I looked at his PDI, and I mean, I've been in ministry for a while, and I was like, oh, this is open shut. We're gonna go in, we're gonna like get under the hood, we're gonna turn some screws. He's gonna be out of here in like 8 weeks. It's gonna be great. I can't wait. Like, we're gonna do this. And I ended up meeting with this person for close to 2 years because it turns out that people are like onions here. There's layers upon layers upon layers, and the PDI only got you that top layer. And as you probe in, you're like, oh my goodness, there's a whole cornucopia of things that need to be dealt with. So never assume, always ask. And using the PDI, even if you're like 15 sessions in with a person or something like that, and you feel stuck, go back to the PDI. See if there's something that you missed. See if there was something that you're like, oh yeah, I was going to talk about that, but I never got around to it. Bringing that back into the conversation might be the thing that helps you move forward if you feel stuck. Another really important tool for gathering data is note-taking. Different people do this in different ways. There's not a good set way to do it. You need to do what works for you, that you can get the data that you need and have it to be able to review. If you try and keep all the facts in your head, you're probably going to run into trouble down the road. Note-taking is helpful because you can get word-for-word quotations. So if someone says something really striking or they say it in a particular way, write that down word for word, hold on to it, and you can actually refer back to it as a form of accountability later on. Like, hey, you said this. These are your words. Do you really believe that? Or have you really changed from that? Like, you can use that as a tool.
Well, with that, I think that's a really good thing, as you said, in terms of you got to do what works for you. So I think even between the two of us, we approach that differently. From what I understand, you're taking copious notes in the session. I'm the one that waits until after to do like a personal debrief download type of note taking, and so even in that, we're doing things differently, but that works for you, and I do it works for me. So yeah. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to, I do think one thing that's helpful to take into a session within your notes are like prepared and targeted questions. If there's a particular issue, especially if you're new to data gathering or even new to counseling in general, trying to think through on the spot all the different ways that you need to ask questions to get at what's going on, that can be a challenge if you're not used to it or experienced in it. And so, especially early on in your counseling journey, don't be afraid to go in with like 15 different questions about one particular topic when you're in that intensive phase. You might only use 5 of them at the end of the day, or it could be that you ask one and they end up answering 2 or 3 other ones. That's great. But getting yourself in the habit and the routine of just regularly coming up with lots of different targeted specific questions that match those criteria we talked about earlier will be really, really helpful. And then, using your notes just to be like, hey, we don't have time to talk about that today, but we'll talk about it in a future session. So you just mark that. I draw a little arrow that like goes over to the back of the page. So I know that in my brain, we're going to talk about this next time. One of the absolute key areas for gathering data that we haven't talked about is halo data, as it is called by some, or just body language. So eye contact. When they talk faster or talk slower, facial expressions. Are they bouncing their leg constantly? Are they picking at their fingernails? Are they biting their fingernails? And notice when those things take place based off of the things that you have said in the counseling session. So if you bring up something that you think might be an area where they might be guilty of some sin, and they physically react to it in some way, you should note that, because there's probably something there. Very few people in the counseling situation are just going to sit there and stonewall you the whole time. When you talk with a couple, notice like where are they even sitting on the couch? Actually, one of the great indicators that marriage counseling is going well is when a couple that starts on the opposite end of the couch, over time they start sitting closer and closer together. And near graduation, they're holding hands in the counseling session. It's great. I love it. But are they laughing at one another's jokes, or is there like coldness there? Do they constantly interrupt one another? Is that getting better or worse as counseling progresses? Do they lean towards one another? Or when one of them talks, is the other one sitting there like, no, like they're disagreeing, even if they're not saying anything. So you've got to watch body language and tie body language to, what did I just say? Okay, that seems to be important. I need to come back to that later. And last, use homework actually to help you with data gathering. Um, so early on, I assign like journaling exercises or disclosure exercises really early on. So um, I'll give them basically a calendar of the week, like every day sometimes. And I'm like, okay, whenever you notice that you fall into this temptation this week, I want you to write the time on the day and write like what was going on, just a little brief blurb. And what you can use that is you can find the patterns of like, okay, it seems like every night at 9 o'clock you stumble into this sin. So what's going on there? Um, and so use homework to help you gather data. Um, you can judge someone's prayer life and how, like, what's their relationship with the Lord like? If you say like, hey, every day this week, I want you to write a 3-sentence prayer about this problem. And before you come to the next session, send that in to me. I just want to read through your prayers and see what your prayer life's like, how you're talking to God. And based off of what they say in their prayer life, you can tell like, man, this person's relationship with the Lord is dry. It's like a spiritual desert. We gotta work on that. Or they've got these like amazing prayers where they're pouring out their heart before the Lord, and you're like, okay, like I think prayer life's okay. We just need to figure out something else. You can use inventory worksheets. There's a lot of them out there. Wayne Mack has, I think he's the king of it. Inventories where it's like rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 in these like 104 different things, husbands and wives, rating one another, all those kinds of things. They're actually really useful. If you overdo it with people, you'll probably just annoy them. So pick the ones that you want to use really strategically, but they are really helpful, and most of them out there are pre-made, and that can help you just with speeding up on prep. And then finally, provide reading assignments to your counselees with teeth. So when I say with teeth, I mean if you just say, go home this week and read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, that doesn't do anything. Hopefully they're reading the scripture, and we believe the scripture is going to change them. But what are you getting out of that as a counselor? So even something as basic as like, I want you to read Matthew 5, 6, and 7 this week, and I want you to highlight 10 verses that stick out to you the most. And in our next counseling session, I'm just going to ask you why. And based off the verses that stick out to them the most, you might discover what they are currently struggling with, or it might help you move forward in answering the questions about their life. So give them some theological reading. If you're going to work through a book with them, don't just say like, all right, read chapter 1. We'll talk about it next week when you come in. Like give them write them some discussion questions out and ask them to answer the questions. And you will gain data from that. Don't just tell them to read, like make them engage with the reading, and you can glean so much data from that.
Yeah, one of the things that we do in our counseling ministry, and the people watching these videos, hopefully they're working through those 14 heart questions that reveal a lot of those heart issues that you've been talking about, and want to make sure that they know that they can use that later on in counseling, because we use that quite often here, not just in the training session, but in our counseling ministry, because it just gives so much information, so much helpful information, and a lot of the good deep stuff that we're looking for really early on.
Definitely. I think usually session 2, I assign questions 1 through 7, and then session 3, I assign the rest of them. Because that one can be pretty overwhelming to answer all at once.
Yes, very much so.
But that becomes normally the number one document that I reference as I'm working with a person by the end of counseling.
That's great. Well, I think you've given us a lot of good things to think about in terms of gathering data and, starting off with this understanding that we don't want to be fools. We don't want to be like Job's friends. We want to make sure that we understand the problem so we can give wise counsel. And I think you've done a great job at helping us understand that. So thank you for being a part of this video.
Thanks, Ryan. It's great to be here.